Maryland football freshmen could draw eyes in the spring.
You are Locked On Terps, your daily podcast on the Maryland Terps. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, everyone? I'm Tre Moore, video content creator for 247 Sports and InsideMarylandSports.com, and host of Locked On Terps, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So thank you for making us part of your day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. New customers join today, and you'll get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 or more wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. I think there are multiple freshmen for Maryland football going into this spring and going into next fall that could make an impact and could surprise people, starting with this spring ball coming up. And as Maryland football begins to transition into spring ball, I guess they're kind of already into it. We'll have the spring game. We'll have all that type of stuff coming up for Maryland football to start talking a lot of football. And I think there are some freshmen that can draw some eyes, can make an impact early on, talking about in the fall, and even do some big things in the spring ball game, and that we're going to hear about for the Terps. I think Maryland's 2024 class ended on a really solid note. Rivals had us ranked as the 31st ranked class, which I thought was about right. A very solid class. 31st ranked is not bad at all. 247 had us a little bit farther back. They had us in the late 40s. I just like to go with the Rivals. I feel like they respect our recruits a little bit more, and our recruits usually have better ratings on Rivals usually than on 247. And I'm not saying 247 is bad, but I just always like to give the benefit of the doubt, and I'll go with wherever we are ranked higher overall. And Rivals has us as a higher ranked class, as 31st ranked in the country. And I think there's a lot of players in this class, and a couple that I'm going to talk about in particular that could make a big impact headed into the spring, draw some eyes in the spring, and then in the fall really solidify themselves as impact players for the Maryland Terrapins. It could be like 3-4 year, I don't want to quite say starters, but maybe first year they get on the field a lot, and then 3 years starter after that, or whatever it may be. I think we have that type of talent in this freshman class. And the interesting thing about it is last year's freshman class, to be honest, I'm not saying it wasn't a good class, but I don't think there was very many guys that made an instant impact. There wasn't any guys that you looked at and were like, oh, like he plays a ton for us right now. He's a starter for us right now as a freshman, and that's to be expected in football. In terms of college football, you usually don't come in and you're not usually the guy early on. Football is the hardest sport, I think, to play right away, just because physically from high school to college, it's a completely different thing in terms of how much you lift, in terms of the nutrition, in terms of adding weight versus losing weight, in terms of all that type of stuff. It is very hard. I think football is probably the hardest sport to come in and play right away. So it's not like our freshman class was bad. It's not like I expect these guys to come in and play, but you do see many freshmen come in right away and usually make an impact. Usually among the offensive line is probably the hardest place to come in and play right away, just because that's the biggest difference physically in terms of the players between high school and football. You usually can see skilled guys come in and make an impact pretty early on, but in terms of defensive and offensive line, it's really hard just because you got to get a lot stronger. You got to usually add a lot of weight, and it's hard to make an impact right away. But I do think this Maryland class, unlike the 2023 class, I do think the 2024 class has some early impact guys. And we thought maybe Rico Walker would be a huge impact guy right away. And he did show some promise early, did a lot of good things, but he decided to enter the portal. I thought he had a really bright future for us, but now he's going to Auburn. I think some people thought maybe Michael Harris could be really good early. I was in that boat as well, and he also showed a couple of flashes. It's not like he played a ton, but I thought he did some really good things as a 2023 and as a freshman for the Maryland football class. I think next year could be a big jump for him as well. I mean, we'll talk about him later on, but I do think he showed some promise in the times we got to see him. But the Maryland linebacker room was loaded with Barham and Hippolyte and Wheatland and Gote, and 3 of those guys are still back overall. So it's going to still be hard for him to get on the field and make an impact. But I think he's too talented next year not to play. But those were a couple of guys I thought maybe could make an impact. I also thought there was a couple other guys in that class that could potentially make impacts right away. But overall, it didn't end up being like that, and none of the freshmen made huge impacts. But I think this year some freshmen will have a shot early on to make an impact and make an instant impact to this team overall. One player I think that in spring ball that we'll see a lot, and a guy that could do some big things for the Terps, is Brandon Jacobs. Brandon Jacobs is very interesting. He was our highest ranked recruit this year. 247 had him in their top 300. Really highly ranked guy. A bunch of schools wanted him at the safety spot. And I think he's the guy that could come in right away and make a huge impact for the Terps. First of all, if you turn on the film, there's a reason he's ranked that high. He's got some traits and some physicality and some length to him that you normally just don't get. He's 6'2", and if he can add some weight this year, add some muscle, I think he can be in a really good spot for the Terps going into the spring and going into the fall. I think he can do some big things for Maryland football. Like I said, he's a really highly ranked guy, top 300 recruit, 4-star on every service you look at. And there was a list that was put together of the best freshmen in each class or each team in the Big Ten, and Brandon Jacobs was our player, and I agree with that. And the interesting thing to me is that Bo Braid is gone next year, and Dante Trader is, of course, back at the safety spot. So there's a couple of different ways that you could go about it. You could think maybe Glendon Miller moves up to safety from the slot corner spot, but I liked Glendon Miller there. I thought he did a lot of good things. I think he stays in kind of that slot spot. I think he was one of the most underrated players on our team and even just in the Big Ten. So you could look at Glendon Miller as a potential guy that could go up to that safety spot to start. There's also plenty of other guys on our roster that could start there, but Maryland likes to rotate a lot of guys. They like to play a lot of different type of players, and I think Brandon Jacobs will get on the field early and could potentially be a starter by the end of the year at that safety position next to Dante Trader. I think that is definitely a possibility, and I think by sophomore year, he definitely has solidified himself as a starter on this team. I think he's too good. I think he's too much length. I think he has too much potential. I think he has too much long-term tools and traits for him to sit. I think he plays pretty early on, and don't be surprised if we see a couple of flashes in the spring game of what he can do, but I do think he has a chance to play pretty early on, and there is kind of a gap in that safety spot, so I'll be interested to see who kind of gets that early nod as the players there. And then we stay in the secondary, but we move positions to the cornerback room, and we brought in 2 really highly ranked cornerbacks in Braden Lee and Kevin Humes. Kevin Humes, of course, did commit recently, and he reclassified up from the 2025 class. And then Braden Lee, we were able to flip him from South Carolina, both 4-star on Rivals. And I think one of these guys will have a shot to play early on to make a big impact. Like I said before, Maryland likes to play a lot of different guys. Sometimes it bothered me last year. I was like, can we just get guys that could start? Can we just have a starting base and not play so many different guys? Because I felt like it hurt us at times. I felt like sometimes our best players weren't on the field. Like Jason Barham last year, I was screaming. I was like, there's no reason for him to come off the field if he's as good as we really think he is. I didn't like some of the rotations in some spots, but that's just what Maryland does. They play a lot of guys. There's benefits into it, and I also think there's some drawbacks to it. But this cornerback room is interesting. It's very interesting going into next year. First of all, I think Braden Lee and Kevin Humes are awesome players. There's a reason they're 4-star type of players. I think they have a ton of traits, but I think that we also lose a lot in the cornerback room. We lose 2 starters in Jaquan Shepard and Tarheeb Still, and it's pretty wide open, I'd say, to who could possibly start in that room. Of course, we have the transfer from Bowling Green in Jalen Husky, who I think is a really good player overall from Bowling Green. I think he can do a lot of big things overall, and he could potentially be a starter. But I do think there's definitely a lot of guys down the roster, but I could see Braden Lee or Kevin Humes sneaking into playing a good amount. Maybe they play in the slot some. I don't know, but I think either one of those guys could potentially play early. I think way more likely that Braden Lee does, just because Kevin Humes, I don't know how ready he is since he reclassified up to be a 2024, but there's also a reason why he reclassified up. You like to think he's ready if he reclassified up, but I do think that Braden Lee or Kevin Humes could make an early impact. And moving over to the offensive side of the ball, I like Mekhi White. I think Mekhi White out of Virginia is a really solid player. The reason I like him is because I like his size. He's like 6'3", 6'4". He could go up to get it. And he reminds me a lot of Caden Prather. He's not quite as thick as Caden Prather yet, but he has that similar kind of size and that similar kind of 50-50 ball kind of mindset. So I think Mekhi White could potentially do some things in the spring and maybe get some snaps here or there in the fall, which will allow him to play in some spots. I think the wide receiver room's pretty loaded right now, but I can see him getting on the field. I think he's a really talented player. He's a 4-star on some websites. On Rivals, I'm pretty sure he was a 4-star. I'm not sure. I would have to check it again. I remember at a certain point he was a 4-star, but he is a 3-star on most websites overall. But Mekhi White, he did some big things at his school in Virginia, and I expect him to be able to continue that. Maybe it's not year one, but I think he could show us some flashes in the spring that could be really cool overall just because of his size and his length overall. And he still has pretty good speed and pretty good elusiveness for his size overall. Let's switch gears to Maryland basketball. How can Maryland basketball have a successful end to the year without a March Madness appearance? I will tell you about that after this ad from FanDuel. Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Because right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Bet on all your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and more. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot. FanDuel, the official partner of the NBA. Maryland basketball, how can we end the year right, and how can we have a successful end of the year despite us not being able to go to March Madness? Maryland basketball season is officially over in terms of a March Madness bid. It's not going to happen. We have no shot at it. We're not a very good team. We're at the bottom of the Big Ten. There's no fantasy anymore that's like, oh, maybe if we win out, we can go. Or maybe if we beat this team, we can go. None of that's going to happen anymore for Maryland basketball. It's basically like we're out of the tournament. We don't really have a shot at it at all. There's just no way we get in. Our record's not good enough. We don't have enough quad one wins. We don't have enough wins, period. We just don't have enough. We don't have a good enough resume. And honestly, it's been like this for a long time that March wasn't really going to happen. I remember there was a certain point in the year where it was like we beat someone big time, and it was like, I think it was after the Illinois game, and our chances moved from like 1% to 5%, and it was like, oh, maybe we can do something with this. But no, it was all false hope. We weren't going to be a March team. We started winning some games at a certain point. We looked a lot better, but we're not a team that's going to be in March Madness overall, which does stink. It stinks because Kevin Willard, year one, did lead us to March. So I thought that maybe we would go back, but we're not going back. Especially being a preseason top 3 team in the Big Ten, the expectation was that we'd go to March, but I don't think this roster was built right. I don't think we were good enough ever to really make it. We don't have enough shooting. We don't have enough overall. We don't have enough depth overall. But how can we end this year successful and on a good note? Because we still have games left. It's not like the season's over yet. Maybe you would consider the season over. Maybe you stop paying attention because the Terps don't have a March Madness bid. But I do think these last games are super important for Maryland to finish on the right note for multiple different reasons. And I'm going to tell you how the Terps can end the year successfully overall. I think the guys who will be back next year, potentially Bachelor, Deshaun Harris-Smith, Kaiser, Lamoth, Maddie, Reese, Calum. To be honest, multiple of those guys could transfer next year, and I think a lot of guys will transfer. I think the portal will hit the Terps hard. But I do think some of these guys will be back, I hope. I hope Kaiser and Deshaun will be back. Julian Reese, I don't know, man. I don't know. I can see him going somewhere else. I can see him declaring. I don't really know. I kind of doubt he comes back to the Maryland thing. But I think for the final games of the year, I think the most important thing is getting these guys looks and building confidence going into next year. I think it would help a ton if we end on the right year for some of these guys. A lot of these guys have struggled. Most of these guys have struggled at some point in the year. No Bachelor has struggled at points. He hasn't played a lot in a lot of games. Deshaun Harris-Smith has definitely struggled. Kaiser has definitely struggled. Reese has struggled at times. And I think that getting these guys kind of going and getting these guys some confidence, and these guys playing pretty well down the stretch could help a lot. And to me, I don't think that will lead to wins maybe for the Terps, but getting these guys some minutes, giving these guys a chance to just show what they can do overall, I think is going to be important down the stretch, and that will be a mark of a successful end to the season. If some of these guys can get going a little bit, if we can get maybe Noah Bachelor going a little bit, I think he's a candidate to a guy that could definitely transfer. And I don't want the Maryland roster to look empty next year. Like, we could be sitting in an empty room going into next year and looking at Kevin Willard better utilize the transfer portal in a big way, or we could be looking at this Maryland team as even worse than maybe this year's team with Jameer Young being gone. So I think a successful end of the season is getting some of these guys going a little bit, building some of their confidence. And that doesn't always mean they're going to put up 10, 15 points. Some of these guys, I just think getting these guys some minutes, just maybe allowing them to hit a shot there, I think just getting them going into next year, I think can be a big deal. And I think that's an underrated part. If you end the year right, even if you're not a good team, if certain players end the year right and end on a high note, it can translate so much going into next year. The players can understand better what they need to do. These games have to be taken seriously for the Maryland Terrapins. And specifically, I think Deshaun Harris-Smith and Jamie Kaiser's, their confidence, how they play down the stretch is going to be extremely important. If they continue to play poor down the stretch, then everyone will be talking about how disappointing these freshmen are, how they're not going to be good going into next year, how next year we're not going to be a good team, how next year we have nothing going on, how next year is going to be a bad year for the Terps because Kevin Willard couldn't recruit the right players in the 2023 class. But if Jamie and Deshaun Harrison finish the year, I don't know how well I'm not saying they might go and all of a sudden Deshaun Harris-Smith looks like he's the Big Ten Freshman of the Year or something like that. I'm not saying that, but if they just end the year playing solid, good basketball, the narrative could be switched a little bit. Maybe people would still have doubts. People definitely would still have doubts. But the narrative would be switched to, oh, these guys played pretty well down the stretch. Maybe that can lead into next year. We've seen them be able to do it. So now they just have to have a whole offseason to continue to put in work. And now we're going to see them be able to do big things in the start of the fall, or starting and going into next year, going into the summer and stuff. So I think that's kind of the narrative that you kind of want for this Maryland basketball team overall. I think it's not going to be easy for them to play well because they haven't played well most of the season. But if those guys can find a way to get on track a little bit down the stretch, I think it's important. It's important for them to develop right going into next year because those two are a huge part. I think that's the number one thing that's most important. I think both of those guys will be back next year. I think those guys have to be starters next year for you. So their development and how they play down the stretch this year, I think, is huge. And if they play well down the stretch, if just those two play well, if everyone else plays poorly, but Kaiser and Deshaun Harris-Smith play really good basketball, I think I look at the end of this year as a success over these last couple of games overall. But that's not going to be easy to do overall. And I think also Jonathan Lamoth, you expect him to get some minutes next year. Give him some minutes at the end of the year. Maybe he doesn't play super well, but give him some minutes. Give him some experience because he's going to need it going into next year overall. But I'd say that's the most important things going into next year. I think you have to find a way to get Kaiser and Deshaun some confidence because I think it's lacking right now. I think you have to get Lamos some confidence, and I think you have to get some guys on the roster some more minutes. I'm looking at Maddie too. I think Maddie could be an underrated piece to this. Think about it. Maddie did some really good things in her last game against Ohio State. He's a really talented player. He's got the length. He's got the athleticism to be an impact player down the road. And Kevin Willard said that's going to take some time for him to develop. But eventually you run out of time. And as a junior, Maddie has to be a good player. And if he can play good basketball down the stretch, we could be looking at him as a really big part to our rotation next year. So he's another really important player, in my opinion, that has to play well down the stretch for the Maryland Terps end of the year to be a good end of the year, in my opinion, and for the expectations to be still high going into next year and we don't lose too much. Let's switch gears again. I want to talk about Maryland basketball versus football. Are we still a basketball school? I will tell you about that after this ad from eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience is what brings home the winning trophy and is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die. You'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. For the longest time, Maryland, I feel like, has been considered a basketball school. But do I still consider us a basketball school after our recent struggles? It's pretty clear that right now I would say that the Maryland football, I would actually say, is in a better spot right now than Maryland basketball. I feel like we got the coach right. I feel like we're building something. I feel like we've been recruiting well. We've been flipping kids. I think Coach Loxley has been doing some really good things. I feel like we've been doing a lot of really good top-notch things with the Maryland football program. I think that we have won 3 straight bowl games now. I think we've done some big things now. And basketball, you could say the opposite. I think we're kind of on the downward slope of things. Last year we went to March Madness, of course, but this year it looks like we're starting to head down, and it looks like things could potentially get worse. Do we still have the right coach? A lot of people want Kevin Willard fired. I don't know if Kevin Willard's the right coach. I think he needs more time. I think he needs more time to develop guys, to recruit guys. You can't kick him out after year 2, especially I thought he had a really solid year 1, so I think he still needs time to really till we see exactly how good he is as a coach. But the Maryland roster doesn't look great. Recruiting could get harder. We might not be in a great spot. But I do still think Maryland is a basketball school, even though this year's been disappointing. Even though the fans haven't been showing up that much for Maryland basketball this year, I do still think that we are a basketball school at heart. The thing is, I think that if we don't continue to get better at basketball and things don't start to look better, football could overtake Maryland basketball because at the end of the day, usually schools are football schools no matter what. I mean, some schools, if you look at the Dukes and the Kentuckys, those schools, the Kansases of the world, those are going to be basketball schools, but a lot of schools want to be football schools. A lot of the money is where football is overall. So don't let Maryland football overtake you, Maryland basketball, because Maryland football, I think, is on the right track to do some really big things and for Maryland to become a bigger and bigger football school. I know we're not known as the biggest football school. We don't usually have the biggest crowds or anything like that, but I think that we're on the right track in terms of football. And basketball, we're not on the right track. So overall, I think there's a lot to improve on with the basketball team, but I do still think that Maryland is a basketball school. That's all we have for today. Thank you for listening to Locked on Terps. Make sure you like and subscribe. We're here every day talking Maryland football and basketball. So thank you for listening to Locked on Terps.